You ever notice how the person who used to break at every little thing suddenly doesn't react anymore? How the empath who once absorbed everybody's emotions like a sponge has now gone quiet, steady, unbothered? That's not numbness. That's not coldness. That's the final stage. That's what happens when an empath finally sees the truth, stops explaining themselves, stops absorbing everyone's chaos, and starts choosing themselves. It's the moment the person who was once controlled by their feelings becomes controlled by their clarity. And once an empath reaches that stage, they don't go back. The empath's turning point begins long before anyone else sees it. It starts quietly, often in the middle of a moment that looks small from the outside, but feels enormous on the inside. Maybe it's a conversation where the same disrespect plays out again. Maybe it's a silent car ride after another argument that felt one-sided. Maybe it's the way the empath notices their own heartbeat speed up around someone who's supposed to care. Whatever the trigger is, it isn't loud. It doesn't explode. It clicks. And that click is awareness stepping in. The very thing that once made them vulnerable becomes the thing that saves them. Empaths feel deeply, sense changes instantly, read energy faster than people speak. For a long time, that sensitivity made them forgive too easily, overlook too much, and hold on far longer than they should have. But in the final stage, that same sensitivity begins working in reverse. Instead of spotting who needs help, they begin spotting who drains them. Instead of tuning into someone else's emotions first, they start recognizing their own. Awareness replaces emotional attachment, piece by piece. Like someone turning on the lights in a room they've been stumbling through for years. At first, this awareness feels uncomfortable. Empaths aren't used to choosing themselves. They're used to interpreting pain, understanding motive, giving benefit of the doubt. They tell themselves stories to make someone else's behavior make sense. But the turning point forces silence between those stories. It shows the empath the pattern, not the excuse. They start seeing that hurtful behavior didn't happen by accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't just their personality. It was a cycle. And they were stuck in it. That realization hits different because empaths don't get angry first, they get honest. Honest about how long they've been shrinking. Honest about how much they've been tolerating. Honest about the cost they've been paying to keep the peace. And once an empath becomes honest with themselves, the entire dynamic shifts. They no longer chase closure from the person who hurt them. They start giving closure to themselves. Their mind begins replaying past moments, but this time with new clarity. Conversations that once sounded confusing now sound manipulative. Apologies that felt sincere now look strategic. The coldness, the blame shifting, the guilt tripping. Things that felt personal now reveal themselves as predictable behaviors. And that is a massive emotional shift for an empath. Because when patterns become visible, compassion naturally starts pulling back. The attachment starts thinning. The hook that kept them tied to the abuser starts loosening. Not because they stop caring, but because they stop lying to themselves. Awareness creates distance, even if they're still physically present. They start speaking less. They stop explaining. They stop defending. They stop reacting the way the abuser expects. This internal distance is the beginning of their power returning. The empath begins noticing how drained they feel after every conversation, how their body tenses before every interaction, how they apologize out of habit, how their nervous system reacts faster than their mouth can. All these little signals become impossible to ignore. Awareness sharpens senses they never realized they were using against themselves. Instead of absorbing someone's chaos, they begin identifying it. Instead of merging with someone's emotions, they begin separating from them. That separation is a major shift because empaths feel connection deeply. Emotional detachment doesn't come naturally. But once awareness becomes stronger than attachment, Detachment begins to grow on its own. This turning point also brings a new kind of clarity. The empath realizes they cannot save someone who benefits from hurting them. They understand that no amount of love, softness, patience, or loyalty can change a person committed to repeating the same patterns. And this understanding is painful, but it is also liberating. It gives the empath permission to stop trying, to stop fixing, to stop being responsible for someone else's behavior. They begin taking back responsibility for their well-being, their energy, their time, their identity, things they didn't even realize they had handed over. Once awareness replaces attachment, the empath starts acting differently without trying to. They withdraw emotionally, even if they're still present physically. They stop oversharing. They stop explaining the same thing repeatedly. They stop reacting to bait. They become more observant, less reactive. Their silence becomes intentional, not fearful. They begin valuing evidence over promises. They start trusting behavior over words. They lean into logic without abandoning empathy. They start questioning things instead of automatically believing them. Their intuition, which was always strong, becomes sharper and more grounded. Emotion no longer clouds judgment. Judgment begins guiding emotion. And during this phase, the abuser senses the shift. They notice the empath isn't as available, not as responsive, not as emotionally predictable. That loss of control makes the abuser try harder, either to pull them back in or to punish them for pulling away. But this is where the empath's turning point becomes irreversible. Because once an empath sees clearly, they can't unsee. They can be guilt, tripped, love bombed, intimidated, or manipulated, but something inside them has already detached. The attachment that once kept them stuck begins breaking on its own. Not because they want revenge, but because they finally understand the truth. Staying is more painful than leaving. Awareness makes them pay attention to themselves in ways they never have before. They start noticing their exhaustion, their anxiety, their self-doubt. They see how much of their life revolved around managing someone else's moods. They see how they lost themselves trying not to lose the other person. And that recognition becomes fuel. It becomes strength. It becomes the early stages of emotional independence. The empath begins investing energy back into themselves. They reconnect with things they once loved. They start speaking to themselves differently. They begin rebuilding confidence, one small decision at a time. Awareness pushes them to grow, even if they're scared, even if they're hurting, even if a part of them still loves the person who broke them. This is the stage where the empath's identity shifts. They stop seeing themselves as someone who was too kind or too forgiving. They begin seeing themselves as someone who was loyal in the wrong direction. Someone who had a deep heart that was mishandled, not a weak heart that was easily manipulated. This reframing empowers them. It helps them understand that their empathy wasn't the problem, the environment was. And once they see that, their entire internal world changes. The empath's turning point is the moment their self-awareness becomes stronger than their emotional attachment, and that is the beginning of everything that follows. Boundaries become the empath's new language after abuse. But this shift doesn't happen overnight. It usually starts with the simplest realization: they are tired. Not just physically tired, but emotionally drained in a way that sleep can't fix. They begin noticing how much of their energy has gone into managing someone else's reactions, trying not to upset them, trying to keep peace that never stays peaceful. And that exhaustion pushes them into a new mindset. They start understanding that kindness without boundaries isn't compassion, it's self-neglect. They start learning that saying yes all the time is not love, it's survival behavior. So the empath begins experimenting with something that once felt terrifying, saying no. The first boundary they set is usually small. Maybe they take longer to reply. Maybe they don't explain themselves as much. Maybe they stop justifying every decision. The people who relied on their passiveness feel it immediately. But the empath doesn't set the boundary to punish anyone. They set it because something inside them is waking up. They're realizing their energy is valuable, their time is limited, and their peace is not free. This is the shift that transforms an empath from someone who absorbs emotional chaos into someone who protects their emotional home. The empath's boundaries begin internally long before they voice them. They think differently. Instead of instantly believing someone's words, they observe their behavior. Instead of assuming responsibility for someone's emotions, they ask themselves whether it's actually their responsibility. They start noticing patterns. They see who makes them feel drained and who makes them feel seen. They start questioning why they tolerated so much before. These inner questions create the foundation for external boundaries. It's like learning a new language, one built on self-respect, not fear of conflict. When they finally begin speaking this new language, people around them feel the shift, especially the ones who benefited from their lack of boundaries. Their reactions vary. Some become defensive, some become angry, some become confused, and some suddenly become very sweet, trying to get the old version of the empath back. But the empath now sees these reactions for what they are, not love, not care, but resistance to losing control. This clarity gives them the strength to continue strengthening their boundaries. They begin to understand something powerful. Anyone who gets angry at a boundary was benefiting from your lack of one. The empath becomes more selective about the access they give. They stop over-explaining. They stop participating in drama they didn't create. They stop showing up for people who disappear when they need support. They learn to say, "I'm not comfortable with that." They learn to walk away from conversations that turn disrespectful. They learn to pause before reacting. This pause is one of the biggest signs of growth, because empaths used to react automatically out of guilt or fear. Now they give themselves space to choose their response, and that space becomes their power. Boundaries for an empath are not walls, they're filters. Filters that decide what gets in and what stays out. They don't shut people out, they shut out behavior that harms them. And because they feel deeply, boundaries become their emotional armor. They're not trying to be cold. They're trying to stay whole. They're trying to protect the parts of themselves they gave away too easily. They're trying to live a life where they're not constantly recovering from emotional bruises. As they grow, boundaries start showing up everywhere in their life. In conversations, in relationships, in friendships, in work environments. They start choosing silence over arguments that go nowhere. They start choosing distance over chaos they can't fix. They start choosing solitude over connection that drains them. And for the first time in a long time, they begin to feel peace. A peace they didn't know they were missing. A peace that feels like coming home to themselves. The empath also begins healing their relationship with guilt. Their entire life, saying no felt selfish. Speaking up felt rude. Putting themselves first felt wrong. Abuse amplified these beliefs. It trained them to think that setting boundaries was a threat to the relationship. But as they heal, they learn that guilt is just an old emotional habit. It doesn't mean they're doing something wrong. It means they're doing something new. And with every boundary they practice, that guilt weakens. Confidence grows where guilt used to live. They also learn something changing boundaries don't require permission. They don't need approval to protect their peace. They don't have to explain why something crosses a line for them. They don't need someone else to agree with their limits. Their boundaries become non-negotiable because they're built on lived experience, not opinion. They start trusting their own judgment again. That trust becomes one of the strongest boundaries of all. People around them begin to treat them differently too. Healthy people respect the new boundaries. They listen, they adjust, they value the empath more because they see them valuing themselves. Unhealthy people push back, manipulate, or withdraw. But instead of chasing them, the empath lets them go. This is a major shift because empaths were once terrified of losing people. Now, they're more afraid of losing themselves again. Their loyalty becomes tied to respect, not attachment. As boundaries become natural for the empath, they also become less reactive to emotional chaos. Someone's anger doesn't control them. Someone's disappointment doesn't guilt them. Someone's silence doesn't panic them. They begin to realize that protecting their peace is not a battle. It's a lifestyle. A lifestyle where they choose what energy they allow in. A lifestyle where their heart stays open, but their access stays guarded. A lifestyle where they still care deeply, but they no longer sacrifice their well-being to keep the wrong people comfortable. Eventually, the empath speaks boundaries with confidence. Not loudly, not arrogantly, but with quiet certainty. And that certainty changes everything. It changes the relationships they attract. It changes the respect they command. It changes the way they see themselves. Boundaries become their new fluency, the language of a healed empath who finally understands their worth. Emotional detachment becomes the empath's strongest form of self-protection after abuse, but it doesn't begin as strength. It begins as survival. It starts in the quiet moments when the empath realizes that caring too much is costing them their peace. They notice their reactions aren't the same anymore. The things that once triggered them now feel distant. The words that used to sting don't land the same. The manipulations they used to fall for no longer confuse them. It's not numbness. It's clarity. And that clarity slowly becomes a shield, one they never had before. This detachment isn't coldness. Empaths were never built to be cold. It's self-preservation. It's the recognition that emotional closeness with the wrong person becomes self-destruction. They start pulling their energy inward instead of pouring it outward. They stop trying to fix feelings that aren't theirs. They stop chasing validation from someone who never intended to give it. They stop personalizing behavior that had nothing to do with them. This emotional distance becomes the first time they feel safe inside their own mind. Like all transformations, it starts subtly. The empath begins responding differently. They don't explain themselves in circles anymore. They don't rush to defend their intentions. They don't overthink every sudden mood shift in the other person. They stop absorbing tension like a sponge. They simply observe. Observation becomes their new default. They watch the behavior without attaching themselves to it. They listen to the tone without adopting the emotion behind it. This distance helps them see the truth more clearly than ever before. Emotional detachment is also the moment the empath stops negotiating with disrespect. Before, they tried to understand it. They rationalized it. They forgave it before it was even acknowledged. But now, disrespect hits a wall. Not a wall of anger, but a wall of neutrality. The empath doesn't react emotionally because they no longer feel responsible for someone else's dysfunction. This is powerful because manipulative people thrive on emotional reactions. When the empath becomes calm, unrateable, and unmoved, the entire dynamic collapses. The empath starts giving silence where they once gave explanation. They give space where they once gave effort. They give detachment where they once offered emotional labor. And in that shift, they take back something they didn't even realize they had lost: their power. Emotional detachment teaches them to separate what they feel from what someone else is projecting. It teaches them that not every raised voice deserves an answer. Not every accusation deserves defense. Not every conflict deserves their emotional investment. They begin experiencing something new: peace in the middle of someone else's chaos. This is one of the clearest signs an empath has entered the final stage. They don't get dragged into emotional storms anymore. They don't get pulled into drama that doesn't belong to them. They don't internalize criticism that's rooted in someone else's insecurity. Their emotional independence becomes stronger than the abuser's emotional influence. This detachment also changes the way they process manipulation. Gaslighting stops working because the empath trusts their perception more than someone else's version of events. Guilt tripping stops working because they refuse to carry responsibility that isn't theirs. Emotional baiting stops working because they no longer need to prove themselves. Silent treatment stops working because they use the silence to recharge instead of panic. Love bombing stops working because they see the cycle, not the charm. Emotional detachment gives them the ability to stay grounded even when someone else is trying to throw them off balance. The most powerful part of this stage is the internal shift. Empaths finally realize that staying emotionally attached to someone who harms them is not loyalty. It's self-abandonment. They understand that detaching is not betrayal. It's survival. They begin valuing their inner world more than external approval. They honor their intuition instead of dismissing it. They protect their heart with the same intensity they once protected others. As they detach, clarity gets sharper. They start seeing people for who they are, not for who they hope they could be. They stop falling in love with potential and start evaluating reality. They stop giving endless chances and start recognizing consistent patterns. This clarity doesn't just apply to the abuser. They start seeing everyone around them more clearly. They separate genuine connections from convenient ones. They separate real support from conditional loyalty. They separate love from attachment. Emotional detachment also changes the empath's relationship with themselves. They start rebuilding the self-esteem that was slowly eroded. They speak to themselves with more compassion. They validate their own feelings. They trust their own judgment. They don't seek external reassurance the way they used to. This self-trust becomes the backbone of their new identity. The empath who once doubted everything now sees the world through a grounded, steady lens. They also begin embracing solitude. Time alone no longer feels empty or scary. It feels like peace, a place where their nervous system can breathe, where their thoughts aren't interrupted, where they can reconnect with who they were before the abuse. This solitude becomes healing, restoring parts of them that they didn't realize were damaged. Emotional detachment allows them to enjoy their own company again. The abuser senses the shift. Detachment threatens their control, so they react. They criticize more, they provoke more, they push harder, or they switch strategies, becoming overly affectionate, suddenly apologetic, temporarily gentle. But the empath sees all of it clearly. What once would have pulled them back in now looks desperate. Emotional detachment removes the hook that kept them stuck in the cycle. Without emotional dependence, the abuser has nothing to anchor them. Eventually, the empath realizes something profound. Emotional detachment is not the absence of feeling. It's the presence of boundaries. It's the decision to stop letting another person dictate their internal world. It's the moment they choose emotional safety over emotional chaos. It's the transformation of their sensitivity into strength. Detachment becomes the lens through which they make decisions. They no longer ask, will they be mad if I do this? They ask, is this healthy for me? They no longer ask, how can I fix this? They ask, should I even be here? They no longer ask, what will they think? They ask, what do I need? This shift changes everything. Emotional detachment becomes the quiet superpower of the healed empath. They can care without losing themselves. They can love without abandoning their needs. They can connect without becoming consumed. Their empathy becomes grounded, not exploited. Their heart stays open, but their access stays limited. Their peace becomes their priority. Their stability becomes non-negotiable. And in this stage, They finally understand something that took them years to realize: not everyone deserves access to their emotions, their energy, or their heart. Not everyone earned the right to feel their empathy. Emotional detachment becomes the filter that protects everything sacred within them. The rise of a new identity in the empath after abuse doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't show up with fireworks, revenge, or dramatic confrontations. It grows slowly, quietly, almost invisibly at first. It starts in a moment where the empath catches themselves reacting differently. Maybe they don't cry this time. Maybe they don't chase after someone who walked away. Maybe they don't try to prove their worth to someone determined not to see it. That shift, small as it seems, is the beginning of the transformation. It's the part where the empath begins shedding who they were forced to become and stepping into who they were always meant to be. This new identity emerges the moment they realize they're done tolerating disrespect. Not because they became hardened, but because they became healed enough to recognize their own value. They stop attaching their worth to someone else's approval. They stop seeing love as something they have to earn. They stop accepting crumbs and calling it connection. They begin expecting the same level of energy they give. And when they don't receive it, they don't internalize it, they adjust their boundaries accordingly. The empath who once tried to avoid conflict now understands that avoiding conflict created more chaos inside them. So the new version speaks up, but not aggressively, calmly, directly, without shaking, without apologizing for feeling something real. This calm confidence is a signature of the new identity. It shows that the empath has learned to separate their voice from their fear. They no longer shrink when someone raises their voice. They no longer cling to relationships that drain them. They no longer allow guilt to run the show. Their identity is no longer based on making others comfortable. It's based on protecting their own well-being. This rise also comes with a new sense of emotional independence. The empath begins enjoying their own company. They feel safe within themselves. They trust themselves more than they trust the promises of someone inconsistent. They feel grounded, stable, and centered. They stop seeking validation from people who never gave it consistently. They give that validation to themselves. They become their own emotional anchor. This is one of the most powerful stages of all, because it's where the empath reclaims the parts of themselves that were pushed aside to keep someone else satisfied. The new identity also comes with a clearer understanding of relationships. They know what respect feels like. They know what manipulation feels like. They know what real love looks like and what performative love looks like. They become able to identify red flags in seconds because they've lived through every shade of them. The empath no longer sees potential as a reason to stay. They evaluate behavior. They evaluate patterns. They evaluate consistency. Their past pain becomes a kind of emotional education, one that now protects them instead of punishing them. Another major shift is how they respond to disrespect. Before, they tried to explain themselves. They tried to reason with people who had no intention of listening. They tried to fix misunderstandings that were never misunderstandings. They were tactics. But now, disrespect doesn't create an emotional spiral. It creates distance. They don't argue. They don't beg. They don't chase closure. They step back. They choose silence. They choose space. And that space becomes their protection. It disconnects them from people who only valued access to their emotional labor. The empath's new identity also comes with a stronger sense of boundaries. Not the shaky, hesitant boundaries they tried to set before, but firm ones that they hold without guilt. They know their limits and they honor them. They don't overextend themselves out of fear of losing someone. They don't give second, third, fourth chances to people who treat them as an option. They don't justify mistreatment anymore. They learned the hard way that boundaries are the doorway to freedom. Another defining trait of this new identity is peace. The empath begins prioritizing peace over everything, over old attachments, over old patterns, over old fears. They realize how precious their emotional space truly is. Peace becomes the standard. Anything that disturbs that peace, they release without hesitation. They're not rude. They're not cold. They're just committed to themselves in a way they never were before. The new empath doesn't need revenge because leaving the situation becomes the revenge. Healing becomes the revenge. Living well becomes the revenge. Elevating mentally, emotionally, and spiritually becomes the evidence of growth. They don't want anyone else to hurt. They just refuse to hurt themselves anymore. Their self-respect becomes louder than their fear of being alone. This new identity brings a new kind of strength, quiet strength. Not the kind that yells or demands attention, but the kind that stands firm without needing validation. They become the type of person who can walk away from what doesn't align with their worth. They no longer cling to the hope that someone will change. They no longer lose themselves in the process of trying to be loved. They recognize that the person they needed to choose all along was themselves. The rise of this new identity is also reflected in how the empath views their past. Instead of blaming themselves for staying too long, they appreciate the lessons they learned. They see their past self with compassion, not shame. They understand why they tolerated certain things. They were surviving, hoping, believing. Now they are growing, evolving, becoming. Their past no longer defines them. It educates them. They stop romanticizing the people who hurt them. They stop replaying conversations, searching for where they went wrong. They stop carrying the weight of someone else's emotional immaturity. Instead, they start focusing on their future. They think about what kind of life they want, what kind of relationships they deserve, what kind of energy they welcome. Their thoughts shift from, why wasn't I enough? To, why was I ever questioning myself for someone who didn't value me? This shift in mindset marks the true evolution of their identity. The empath also begins expressing themselves differently. They say what they feel without fear of being dismissed. They share their truth without worrying about being judged. They communicate with clarity instead of emotional over-explaining. They stop apologizing for having standards. They stop apologizing for their sensitivity. They stop apologizing for walking away. They realize sensitivity is not a weakness. It's a superpower that just needed stronger boundaries to protect it. By this stage, the world sees the difference. The empath is still kind, still compassionate, still soft, but they are no longer accessible to everyone. They are no longer emotionally available to those who take without giving. They smile the same, but they protect their heart differently. They love the same, but they choose who they love more wisely. They care the same, but they no longer carry what doesn't belong to them. They rise, not in bitterness, but in self-awareness, not in ego, but in self-respect, not in anger, but in clarity. The new identity of the empath is the final evolution, a person who still feels deeply, but never loses themselves in the process.